As you can remember, it was all lies.
Intelligence services built up a very widespread system of pro-Russian propaganda and fake media outlets, supported and amplified by other proxy groups.
What has changed, though, are the dissemination methods.
Hello and welcome to Ukraine in Flames, a special project by Ukraine Media Center and NGO Euro-Atlantic Course. My name is Alexandra Tsakhanovska, and as an expert in countering Russian disinformation and propaganda, it is my pleasure to say that today we will discuss how it has changed after the start of the large-scale invasion of Ukraine in February. Targeting the Western countries, has Russia come up with new techniques and new narratives? If you want to find out, please subscribe to our channel to stay tuned. Disinformation is not something that just came into being a couple of years ago, despite being a rather fashionable, widely discussed concept. In fact, its very name originates from the Russian word disinformация, and it is something that Soviet and Russian secret services have been doing for decades. So they definitely have a lot of tricks up their sleeve. How have they played out just before the start of the large-scale invasion and then immediately after it? What were the key target audiences and how has Russian propaganda addressed those audiences? We've talked to Andrej Poleščuk, analyst at the Kremlin Watch program of the European Values Center for Security Policy, to find out.
So today I would like to speak about Russian propaganda and their influence in Europe. We can divide Russian propaganda before the invasion and after that. There are two main areas that we can focus on. The propaganda that was intended for the Russian population, and it was mainly focused on the delegitimization of the Russian opposition. The second area is the propaganda that was intended for the Western audience. As you can remember, Russians were moving their troops towards the Ukrainian border, and they were trying to claim that the military is not danger for the Ukraine as a country and their military. As you can remember, it was all lies, and the Russians started the full-scale conflict. Also, after this invasion, we can divide Russian propaganda into two areas. The first area is also intended for the Russian population, and it was all about the war. There is a pro-war movement with the symbols of Z and V, and the propaganda was trying to promote the war and persuade the Russians to support it. The second area was the area intended for the Western audience. For the first few weeks, Russians were not very active in this area, but between the half of the March and mainly in April, Russians started to promote the war in the West. As you can see, the example of Bulgaria, there was 10 times more propaganda in the country than before the invasion. Some states were trying to oppose the propaganda by shutting down the websites, mainly in the Czech Republic, but mainly we can say that Russian propaganda is stronger and stronger, and we need tools that will prevent Russians to spread their information in the European area. As for methods of dissemination, we cannot see very much changes. First of all, Russians don't have this much money to promote the information and try to strengthen their own information capacities in the West. Secondly, there were atrocities in Bucha and other cities in Ukraine, and it's really hard for Russia to persuade or to promote the war after they were doing war crimes.
Evidently, Russian disinformation has indeed been in for a long game, at which the Kremlin was quite successful. It means that a lot of tools and methods have already been tried out and the whole networks of proxy actors established. So we asked Olaf Boenke, a senior advisor at the Alliance of Democracies Foundation, to share his insights on the impact of Russian propaganda efficiency after the large-scale invasion of Ukraine.
What notable changes, to the best of our knowledge, has Russian disinformation aimed at foreign audiences undergone since the start of the large-scale invasion of Ukraine and until the end of July 2020, so as of today? I would say, first of all, there's no need for substantial changes. So the Kremlin and its intelligence services built up a very widespread system of pro-Russian propaganda and fake media outlets, supported and amplified by other proxy groups, which goes over all social media platforms, messenger services like Telegram, and other social media and online channels. So in the past, the system has already been used quite successfully to deepen the polarization around already existing controversial topics in each target country. In Germany, where I'm based, for instance, in 2015, these networks fueled the debate on refugees coming from the Middle East. During the COVID pandemic, then in 2020, the same groups amplified false narratives about vaccines and restrictions to mitigate the pandemic. And now they switched again the topic and used the very same mechanism in the Kremlin's very own interest, meaning here pro-Russian narratives in the context of the Russian war in Ukraine. So this aspect of using and benefiting from the global system of manipulation and infiltration for Putin's very own case, this is the key difference from my point of view, what have been observed before or in the difference before February 24th and after. So what are the key elements and narratives of Russian disinformation since February 24th? If you want to read a very detailed analysis of how disinformation and cyber intrusion have become a substantial element of modern hybrid warfare, as I just described, I recommend you Microsoft's recent special report, Ukraine, an overview of Russia's cyber attacks activity in Ukraine. Here, they documented how strongly aligned cyber attacks and military attacks on the battlefield have been since the beginning of the Russian war. What we have seen in terms of disinformation narratives, I would say it is a lot of repetition of well-known anti-Western, anti-democratic, anti-EU, anti-NATO narratives. So you can check out the websites of groups like EU versus Disinfo, the Hamilton 2.0 dashboard from our colleagues from the Alliance for Security and Democracy at the German Marshall Fund, or fact checkers across the world like AFP, or in Germany, for instance, Correctiv. They documented this very well. They all serve the same objective, to divide society by aiming at the fringes, so as I described before. Do we notice any substantial changes in the target group? I would say not really. Of course, the key objective, as I described, is to undermine the credibility of the societies we live in. It's of course primarily aimed at undermining the credibility of Ukraine as an independent country. One of the upcoming ongoing narratives is, of course, that of Ukraine as a failing state, Ukraine as a puppet of the United States. So all these kind of false narratives. I think two important observations here are concerning me, and I think we should look at this more closely in the upcoming month. The one is the Russian information manipulation aimed at Russia's domestic audience. So the kind of what Russian people think about the war and how it affects actually their relationship to foreign communities. So recently we had seen a lot of reports by Germans, as I mentioned, I'm based in Berlin, who reported from family members calling from Russia and asking actually how they survive in Germany. So, and then when they asked, okay, why are you asking? So then they revealed that there are horrible and completely false stories shared on Russian media about the conditions, the living conditions in Germany, for instance, due to the cut of Russian gas, a lack of hygiene because we can't shower hot any longer with hot water, stuff like this. So one of the changes, or one of the challenges and the questions for us in the future will definitely be, how can we engage with Russia's civil society and the general public, and to counter these kind of false narratives about Western societies or democratic societies. The second one is, who will win the information war over the dominant narratives on the causes of the Russian war and its aftermath in the so-called in-between countries. So this race is aimed primarily at countries in the global south, Africa, parts of Asia, parts of South America. And the question here is, who is to blame, for instance, for the global food crisis? So the Russian narrative is, if this is all about Western sanctions. So, but of course, they don't give information why the Western sanctions or the sanctions of the free world actually have been imposed in the first place. So here, many anti-Western, post-imperialistic narratives flowing in here, Russia and China increasingly are joining forces and trying to create a new us against them narrative, which is a high risk, I would say, for the democratic and free world in the upcoming months, because this is really dangerous and we will be probably feel the consequences of this even years later when the war is long over.
So we have discussed the key target audiences for the Kremlin and established those. However, what can we say when it comes to the broad toolkit of Russian disinformation and its methods, combining traditional media, proxies, and online environment to reach its goals? Let's welcome Anna Honen, who will tell us more.
The main lines of Russian disinformation campaign have not changed. It is based on repetition, not innovation. So just as it has been dehumanizing Ukraine for 8 years before the invasion, just it has now continued doing so. There was a peak in that kind of messaging just before the invasion in January on Russian state TV, and we see these repetitive messages also now. Where the aim is to justify Russia's aggression and invasion of Ukraine. When it comes to the Western audiences, there hasn't been significant changes. Russia is using continuously sort of whataboutism agenda to undermine and diminish Western support to Ukraine. And recently it has been focusing especially on switching the blame of causing a potential global hunger from Russia to the West, as well as focusing especially on negative effects of sanctions in the West, and exaggerating protests against fuel prices or food prices and so on. What has changed, though, are the dissemination methods, as the West and the European Union has put sanctions against Russian channels. So Russia is increasingly trying to circumvent these sanctions and social media platform policies. For example, by using local proxies to deliver the same kind of messaging as Russia Today would have been delivering earlier, as these local proxies fall beyond both sanctions and social media platform policies. Another worrying development is the increased activity of pro-Russian hacker groups. Also those that have appeared after the invasion, and increased use of hack and leak as tactics. And especially worrying is the targeting of individual users and individuals, mostly Ukrainians, as well as Russian oppositioners. And there is a potential risk that these type of targeting and attacks, both online and offline, could spread to the wider Europe as well. And these hacker groups with organized, coordinated DDoS attacks have been also very active towards the Baltics, especially Lithuania and Estonia. Also Latvia. When it comes to the wider Nordic region, Sweden and Finland and the NATO accession, Russia has kept sort of constant pressure in signaling that they are ready to put more pressure on the countries. An example is a poster campaign in Moscow by the Swedish embassy that has continuously targeted especially the elites, political decision makers in these countries. And the latest poster was about showing how Sweden and Finland are just toys in evil Americans' hands. Thank you.
So in terms of notable changes, we have seen the increase of hacker groups' activities and adaptive dissemination methods and the growing use of local proxies. Ukraine, unfortunately, has the first-hand experience in dealing with similar challenges, as it is often perceived as a testing ground for Russian hybrid influence. So we also present the Ukrainian perspective on the issue, coming from Maria Sahaidak, an expert at the Center for Strategic Communications and Information Security of Ukraine.
Says to the Ukrainian journalists and Western journalists who have been in Ukraine weeks before the Russian full-scale invasion, the world had a chance to see the truth about Russian invasion and the crimes committed by Russian army. But despite that, Russian propaganda was still working on European TV channels and media. It seemed significantly weakened at the start of the full-scale invasion, but it has regained its strength just weeks after that, and particularly in Europe. Sure, it has changed its form and shape, and now it's more settled, but it's still there, quickly retransmitted and reshared. Quotes by Vladimir Putin and Sergei Lavrov, false accusations and statements, repetitions of the old mantra about Russian strategic interests are still there. And even when the lies are being pointed out, they are repeated, and the viewers, the listeners, get to hear and see them again and again. The perfect example of Russian narrative that was spread around Europe and still spreading around European countries is a narrative about Russian strategic interests. Russia is simply protecting itself, they say, protecting its strategic interests and area of influence. And yeah, the war is bad, but it would not have happened if NATO did not provoke us. If Russia was assured that Ukraine would remain a neutral country, it would be peaceful and safe and nothing would have happened. This narrative is happily promoted by some Putinists and sympathizers in Europe who do not deny the war actually, but shift the blame from Russia and Putin and his supporters to the West. Another narrative is repeating Russian propaganda language. Russian war against Ukraine is presented as a Ukrainian crisis or Ukrainian conflict. Russian soldiers are turned into regime's victims because they were lied to and forced to go to Ukraine. And the same applies to other Russians. They are just victims of the regime or victims of the state TV. This narrative shifts the focus from the actual situation in Ukraine, a war full of terrifying atrocities. Now it's much smaller, just a local conflict between brotherly nations, which actually doesn't need that much support and attention from the world. Russian propaganda has been questioning Ukrainian identity, our right to decide, our right to defend ourselves for years. Now, Russian propaganda is still using this method. They recently started actively using the topic of military aid to Ukraine, in particular in those countries who help us the most. They are spreading the messages that these weapons are not properly used in Ukraine or being mishandled or even sold on the black market. This narrative has two goals. First of all, they try to discredit Ukraine and Ukrainian army, as well as to reduce support from European and Western countries to Ukraine. So, as we see, despite the fact that sanctions are being introduced in European countries against Russian mass media that has directly connection to the Kremlin. There remain media that work in European countries but do not have a direct connection to the Russian state broadcasters. However, they still reproduce narratives of Russian disinformation campaign, Russian propaganda, from the fact that they justify Russia's aggressive policy with the same messages as Russian politicians and Russian journalists, media, to the fact that they use the same languages cliché. So Kremlin propaganda machine has been there for years. And now we see that Russian propagandists and Russian disinformation have been accompanying Russian military threat to Ukraine and the world for years. So throughout all of this, Russian information warfare followed its military, conquering many minds across Europe. And we cannot let this happen and win Russia propaganda again.
You've been watching the special project by Ukraine Media Center and NGO Euro-Atlantic course, Ukraine in Flames. If you find our work useful, please like and share this video and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. In the description to this episode, you can find information on how you personally can help Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression. Remember that everything is going to be Ukraine.